Thank you for tuning in to the Rydell Law Firm Library and Odyssey channel. Have a couple articles that I've seen in the last month that I wanted to highlight. I've paired them together because they're both on the same theme, really, and kind of have the same idea. The first being from RT Russia Today with the headline, U.S. sanctions are losing their effectiveness. The second coming from Zero Hedge, which is an aggregator, with the headline, Sanctions Set America on the Path to War, Claiming Lives with No Benefit. So rather provocative headlines there, and I know our videos and our topics about sanctions are always really popular and interesting, and folks reach out and have questions about them, so I figured I'd cover these and give some commentary. So the first, the RT article about sanctions losing their effectiveness, this is objectively true. Now, this article starts by pointing out the economic forecast for heavily sanctioned countries like Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua, showing that their economies in 2022 are projected to have increases or growth in their GDP, which it's not a great increase. There's like around 3%, 2 or 3%, with Venezuela projecting 4.5% growth. So I'm not GDP and that type of growth forecasting there's a lot of voodoo behind it, behind the science. So I don't know if I would necessarily just take those assumptions at face value. Really, from what I have good friends and clients from Venezuela here doing business here in the U.S. Who paint a dire picture, I guess, from their perspective, that it's definitely not what it used to be, and there are challenges for everybody there. So I'm not sure that they would be the best example. Now, Cuba obviously has been under U.S. sanctions for, 70 years or so, and they're still chugging along. It's not a great place to be, but they survive, right? And frankly, they survive a lot because they do business with Europe. They do business with a lot of Latin America still. It's really primarily the U.S. that has sanctions still remaining. So yeah, I don't know if I agree with the assumption there about the economic forecast being an indication that sanctions are failing, but objectively we know within with the sanctions, trade law space, that sanctions fail often. And I say fail in regards to they don't typically achieve the goal that they are initially set out and designed to force. Examples of this would be Iran, obviously, for years. Even before Iran, really Iraq as well. They were sanctioned heavily for a decade or so, from the mid-90s or maybe the early 90s, the early 90s until the U.S. invaded Iraq. And the sanctions did not foster regime change. It just didn't happen until we had to put boots on the ground there and do it, the old-fashioned way. Those are prime examples recently that have failed. I would also point to Bahrain, which is an interesting subject. Or not Bahrain, Qatar. I'm confusing my my countries there in the Persian Gulf. So Qatar, they had a spat with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates about 6, 7 years ago, and ended up becoming embargoed by other members of the GCC, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is kind of their trade group, their regional group to solve issues and collaborate together on economics and defense and things like that. They were all members of it, Saudi, UAE, Qatar. There was a spat, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, I think Egypt, and maybe another country or two, probably Oman, I'm not sure, decided to embargo Qatar based on a lot of things. I don't really want to get into the politics, but anyways, the sanctions were not unilateral, they were not multilateral. They were unilateral, meaning that only a handful of countries imposed them. Some major countries around them that did not impose sanctions were Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait. Trying to think of who else is nearby. India didn't embargo them. So major countries around Qatar did not embargo them, and essentially the Qataris created and developed domestic industrial production to replace those imports that were embargoed. One of the famous example that I've seen, and I've had folks who were there tell me about it, is their dairy industry. They had no dairy industry. They're obviously being a desert country in a very small island. They don't have pastures. They don't have cows to create dairy products. When the embargo occurred, they airlifted in cows. They airlifted in the feed and stuff like that. Created a domestic dairy industry, and now they export dairy to other GCC countries. So really, really interesting. A prime example of how sanctions fail. This is also somewhat similar to the situation in Russia, where the U.S. sanctioned the energy industry, and then later on some aspects of the banking industry, like the municipal bond market and things like that. And Russia, it's not a multilateral sanctions regime, so Russia's not embargoed by the world. It's just basically the United States and Western Europe. So they are able to continue trading. They have bolstered and spent money developing infrastructure for their own domestic production, and they are in a better place. It's really interesting. I go to Russia every year, at least once, sometime for a couple months typically, and they have domestic food products on the shelves that rival our own in the U.S. So it's very, very interesting. Where that wouldn't have been the case, 7, 8, 10 years ago. They wouldn't have had those types of products developed in Russia and on Russian shelves for sale. So in the article points out some of the same things that the sanctions just don't result in success. They don't change regimes. They don't end up causing countries to change course. They usually dig their heels in and just find ways to break the sanctions. So even though I practice international trade law and understand sanctions and help counsel clients on sanctions compliance, my personal opinion, and really from a technical standpoint, they don't work, frankly. It's a lot of political theater, and it's a way to create, what would be the word? And maybe not drama, but a way to create friction without going to war, frankly. So it's good in that sense. It's I'd rather sanction somebody than send troops over, right? So the other article is about is an opinion piece describing the situation that America, when we begin sanctioning and embargoing other countries, it basically creates animosity and will lead to physical, violent conflict, which has been the case historically. And that's not just the United States. I mean, historically, you look at how embargoes and sanctions were used, it was typically a prelude to war. And in many cases, like this article is pointing out, it became a reason for war. Whenever trade is restricted and nations cannot trade openly, they can't get essential goods or goods that they need or whatever that they want, it creates a lot of animosity, and it creates a lot of angst, I guess, at the geopolitical level, where no longer are you interested in trying to negotiate because there's an embargo, right? How are we going to break the embargo? So I do agree with the premise of this article. It's really, really interesting. They point out some of the studies that have kind of historically looked back at sanction regimes and their success. Points out here that the list of countries the U.S. is currently waging what's called maximum pressure campaigns against: Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Syria, with Yemen and Cuba and China also on the list. Yemen because of their civil war. And from what I understand, the Yemen embargo, or it's not, I don't know if it's an embargo, but the Yemen trade restrictions are primarily arms-based. I'm not familiar with anything beyond that. They might be at this point, but it's not something that's come up in our practice lately. So I'm going to link to this article. It's very, very interesting. It also points out, so one of the most recent and prime examples being Iraq and Yemen, about how U.S. blockades, U.S. embargoes, and trade restrictions causes humanitarian crisis, where there's starvation or there's lack of medical goods or other type of agricultural and food products where people just can't live, they can't survive. And yeah, that is collateral damage of a lot of sanction regimes that the U.S. has pushed. So it's a really good article from, you know, an opinion outside the box if you have never considered sanctions and what the flip side is, what the danger of it is. This is a really great article to kind of get that flip side of the coin and get the other side, the other opinion, right? So interesting stuff. Just wanted to share those articles about sanctions. Again, so we here at Rydell Law Firm, we practice international trade law. We represent folks with import and export compliance. And if you need help with understanding sanctions, understanding how to comply with sanctions appropriately and make sure your products, your exports aren't seized or detained and get you in a lot of trouble, you can go to jail for breaking sanctions, even if you don't do it on purpose, because it's what's called strict liability. That's what we do. We keep you out of jail. We keep your products on the move and out of detention, out of seizure. Call Rydell Law Firm today. Let's help you out with your sanctions compliance and make sure you stay on the right track. You guys have a great day.